Hello again. In our first lecture, we saw that when the government provides services to people, it is being utilitarian efficient. But economists regard the provision of many government services as being inefficient. Don't they agree that the provision of these services is utilitarian efficient? They don't even think about it. Utilitarianism is not the definition of efficiency that they use. The definition they use was authored by the economist Vilfredo Pareto, and it is according to this definition that many, if not all, government programs are inefficient. In this lecture, we cover Pareto efficiency. We have already done most of the prep work in our first lecture about supply and demand. Today, we add the concepts of consumer and producer surpluses, and then we will learn about Pareto efficiency. Before we start, a note. This lecture is somewhat technical. For econ students, it is mandatory. All others may skim it. We start with the example of the housing market of the last lecture. There are 7 families who want to rent apartments in the city, and each has a reservation rent. There are only 6 apartments available for rent, and therefore the market rent will fall between $1,500 and $2,250. We assume that the rent is $2,000 a month, which falls within that range. Family A's reservation rent is $6,000, yet it is paying for the apartment only $2,000. Therefore, by renting the apartment, Family A is $4,000 better off. The difference between a consumer's reservation price and the price she actually pays is called the consumer surplus. Each of the 6 families that get apartments earns a consumer surplus. But for poorer families, this surplus is smaller. The consumer surplus is the difference between what a person is willing to pay for a good and what she actually has to pay for it. Apartments yield the same utility to the poor as to the rich, but they generate more consumer surplus when they are occupied by the rich rather than by the poor. This is because the consumer surplus is measured in dollars, not in utility. Because of this, the consumer surplus is a bad tool for policy evaluation, but this is the tool that economists use. In a similar way to the consumer surplus, we can also measure a producer surplus. The producer surplus is the difference between the revenue the seller receives, which is equal to the price, minus the cost of production. In our example, the cost to the landlords is 0, so the producer surplus is $2,000 per apartment. Now that we know what consumer and producer surpluses are, we are ready to tackle Pareto efficiency. We will explain this definition via an example of rent control, and we will see that rent control is not Pareto efficient. In future lectures, we will see that by the same reasoning, many government programs that help the poor and the middle class are also Pareto inefficient. Suppose the government passes a rent control law that sets the rent at $500. This means that the producer surplus per apartment is $500 instead of $2,000, and what landlords lose, tenants win. Each family's consumer surplus increases by $1,500. But at a rent of just $500, Family G can also afford an apartment. And suppose that instead of families A to F, it is families B to G that end up with apartments. In this case, A does not have an apartment and G does.
This means a loss of consumer surplus by A of $5,500 and a gain of consumer surplus by G of $1,000 because G's reservation price is $1,500 and the rent now is $500. The total surplus lost is therefore $4,500. And this is the essence of why rent control is Pareto inefficient. It is Pareto inefficient because it gives poor people apartments that in dollars rich people value more. Had the rich gotten these apartments, their consumer surpluses, not their utilities, would have been larger. Pareto dressed up his definition with a logical, though abstract justification. We will explore this justification, but before we do, let's examine the reality of rent control in New York City, where it has been in force since 1943. The rent control law in New York City has expiration built into it. It expires automatically when the rental vacancy rate exceeds 5%. In order to establish what the vacancy rate is, New York City contracted the Census Bureau to conduct a housing and vacancy survey once every 3 years. The last one was conducted in 2017. Table 8 tells us that 75,000 apartments are vacant because they are held for occasional use. Another 27,000 apartments are held vacant for other reasons. Since the choice of possible reasons is long, other reasons may mean that these apartments are held as investments. It is reasonable to assume that the apartments that are occupied only occasionally, or not at all, are located in prime locations in the city, close to Central Park, Lincoln Center, and public transportation. In plain English, the rich can deprive the poor of the use of these public treasures, even if they are not going to use them themselves. Rent control in New York City is the target of organizations like the Reason Foundation that is financed by the Sarah Scaife and the Koch foundations. Both are major contributors to the climate change denial movement and campaigners against government regulation. Reason claims that rent-controlled apartments go to the rich, so let's check whether the claim is true. The rent control regulations in New York City are adjusted to changing economic conditions, and as a result, there are 3 types of controls. The oldest one is simply called rent control, and the 2 others are called rent stabilization. The all other rental units category in the table are different types of public housing. As the table shows, even after 70 years of operation, rent control benefits its intended targets, which are the poor and the middle class. The median household income of tenants in unregulated apartments was $67,000 in 2016, far higher than the income of tenants in rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments. We can see that public housing reaches its intended targets as well. Just as the Reason Foundation says, some rent control units do go to wealthy families. These are the families that the Reason Foundation chooses to highlight. But we must judge regulations by their overall impact, not by outliers. No government program is perfect, but we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Despite the existence of some wealthy beneficiaries, the evidence shows that rent control mainly helps the poor and the middle class. Not only interested billionaires attack rent control. 93% of economists believe that rent control reduces the quantity and quality of housing. But the numbers do not support this belief either. Let's talk about quantity first. Low rents are affordable, and it is therefore not surprising that in the controlled sector, the vacancy rates are low. Of course, had the quality of these units been low, people would not have wanted them, and the vacancy rates would have been high. But this is not the case. It is not the case also in the direct evidence that we will examine in a minute. In the free market sector, the vacancy rate is 6%. Had rent control had a deleterious effect on the supply of rental units, we would have expected the vacancy rate to be low. So is it? It is high compared to the rate in the controlled sector, but let's compare it to the vacancy rate in Atlanta, a major city that does not have rent control at all. In Atlanta, the vacancy rate is also 6%. Rent control does not create a housing shortage or high rents. It is a response to them, as the headline from Atlanta shows. When markets function well, there are no costs to regulate them. But when they fail to deliver the goods and the government does not intervene, the poor and the middle class suffer. Let's talk about quality. Does rent control decrease the quality of housing, as the economists believe? Table 18 shows that the percentage of dilapidated units is minuscule and that the vast majority of rental buildings in New York City have no defects. Unfortunately, I could not find a survey of housing quality in Atlanta to permit a comparison. But of course, rent control only works if the rents are actually lower. So are they? They are. In 2017, median rent for free market apartments was $1,700, but it was between $915 and $1,400 for controlled units. We conclude that rent control is a good response to a housing crisis. In New York City, for more than 70 years, poor and middle-income families have been paying lower rents without a negative impact on either the quantity or quality of housing in the city. Berlin has just passed a rent freeze law, and as we have seen, in Atlanta there is a call for rent control as well. So how does Pareto efficiency bear on the question of rent control? Wilfredo Pareto authored the definition that bears his name at the beginning of the 20th century. The definition is as follows. An allocation of resources is Pareto efficient if it cannot be changed in a way that will make at least one person better off without making anybody else worse off. This may be a little bit hard to follow, so let's apply the definition to one case which is Pareto efficient, a poker game, and let's see how it works in that case. Suppose that in the game, one player cleans everybody else out. He is rich while the losers are totally penniless. This allocation of money to people is Pareto efficient because the only way to help the losers is to take money away from the winner. We are now ready to discuss rent control and to see that it is not Pareto efficient. It is not Pareto efficient because with rent control it is possible to dream of taking apartments away from the poor and giving them to the rich without hurting the poor, on the contrary, while helping them. The deal is as follows. Family A makes Family G an offer.
You value the apartment at $1,500, family A says to family G, but we value it at $6,000. We will sublet the apartment from you for $4,000. You will continue paying the landlord the $500 rent and earn $3,500 extra cash. Family G will of course agree, and both families will be better off. The new allocation is a Pareto improvement over the old allocation in which the poor family lived in the city. A Pareto improvement is a change that makes at least one person better off without making anybody worse off. Let's summarize. If subletting rent-controlled apartments were legal, the rich would have paid the poor to move out of their rent-controlled apartments. This would have made both families better off. Therefore, it is possible to reallocate the apartments and make at least one family, actually two, better off without making any family worse off. We are ready for a verdict. Rent control is not Pareto efficient. Compare this with the free market. In the free market, the apartments go to the rich. The poor do not have the money to pay the rich to vacate their apartments willingly. Therefore, the only way to make the poor better off is by making the rich worse off. This makes the verdict clear. The free market is Pareto efficient. Rent control is not Pareto efficient. What to do? Should the sublet of rent-controlled apartments be permitted? The justification for rent control is that poor and middle-class families should be able to live in desirable locations, close to amenities and close to work. If they don't take advantage of these opportunities, the justification is false and rent control would be abolished. This means that the sublet exercise is a trick. It compares rent control to an alternative allocation of resources that is not real. Economists routinely judge policies as Pareto inefficient by comparing them to phantom alternatives. This is irrational and therefore wrong. Should rent control be abolished? This would benefit rich families and landlords at the expense of poor and middle-class families. New York City's long experience with rent control shows that it is a good, if only partial repair, to the free market's inability to allocate housing in a way that is utilitarian efficient. Of course, alternative policies that can make some people better off without making other people worse off should be adopted. On the other hand, policies that help the poor and the middle class should not be abolished unless they are replaced by policies that in fact, not in theory, would make the poor and the middle class better off. Here is food for thought. Is Pareto efficiency a good tool for evaluating policies? Second question. Do Pareto efficiency evaluations differ from utilitarian efficiency evaluations, and if they do, how? We will discuss these questions in the next lecture.